The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was presented to Congress in the aftermath of alleged attacks on U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf on August 2nd and August 4th, followed on August 5th by a retaliatory bombing strike by U.S. aircraft against North Vietnam. The Johnson administration presented the alleged attacks as acts of war against the United States, justifying an appropriate response. Placed wiretaps on the telephones of the Democratic campaign headquarters. Nixon was a fan of wiretapping and had relied on its use before 1972. In 1969, secret bombing missions against Viet Cong supply routes in Cambodia were disclosed to the press. These missions were just a small part of many secret activities carried out by the American government during the Vietnam War. Nixon believed those leaks to the press to be subversive in opposition to government and authorized 17 wiretaps on newsmen and his own White House aides. He claimed these wiretaps were for the purpose of national security. The public's reaction was a major player in the Vietnam War. There were people called hawks who were most Republicans and some conservative Democrats, and they were the people who knew the war had to happen. And the doves, they were the people that were left that didn't want the war to happen and were the major protesters.
According to Historian.com, the U.S. did not necessarily lose the war in Vietnam as much as they failed to win this war. They did not overthrow communism, which was the aim as presented to the public, and so pulling out or not winning are equated with losing the war, which technically is not true. The U.S. used the argument of the domino effect to create a cause to go to war in Vietnam, and they believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and then Burma and India would soon follow suit. The reasons for America not winning the war are numerous, but nevertheless, they can be divided into distinct categories: army tactics, terrain, the war at home, and the relative strength of the North. Our army tactics were terrible. They were basically shoot anything or one that you came in contact with. The terrain was summed up to be a jungle. The war at home wasn't really a war at all. It was just the same as before. Nothing was rationed or stopped any productions of things. The war really took the Americans over during the evening when they would all sit at the TV and watch the horrifying war in Vietnam. There was also the anti-war protests and the hippie counterculture. The relative strength of the North was based off of the open sea navies, while the rest of us had only coastal navies. These navies could transport large numbers of troops for long distances, continuously defend large areas of their empires all at once, and protect their lifeline of economies that were their sea-based trade interests. The Vietnam War changed America in many different ways. It's very well known that Vietnam dealt a profound blow to our self-image. After the coalition forces, dominated by troops and leaders from the U.S., won a victory, President Bush declared, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." This clearly demonstrates that after Vietnam, Americans no longer believed they were militarily invincible and were less willing to support foreign troops abroad. Even before the war ended, Americans were beginning to change their historical approach to liberating unstable countries. After Vietnam, Americans no longer believe it's their place or within their power to police the world, even for the greater good. Instead, our new approach is to enable locals to protect and maintain themselves.
After escalating U.S. involvement in Vietnam through the 1960s, President Richard M. Nixon announced in 1969 that the U.S. would begin withdrawing its forces from the war-ravaged country. With stepped-up American training, the South Vietnamese were encouraged to play a larger role in their own defense. Despite the U.S. troop withdrawals, opposition to the war increased. Anti-war protests and marches drew thousands of people in Washington, D.C. and other cities throughout the country. Television brought the war into America's living rooms. scenes of the war's horrors turned many people against continued U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The last American ground forces left Vietnam in 1973, but the war did not end until 1975, when South Vietnam surrendered to the North. As the North Vietnamese army entered Saigon, people fled to the American embassy. Congress provided emergency aid to evacuate Americans and some South Vietnamese from the city.